Ultron is one of the most feared and formidable villains that the Avengers have faced in their storied history. Created by Roy Thomas and John Buscema, this evil android has proved to be one of the deadliest characters in the entire Marvel universe. A dark reflection of his maker Hank Pym, from his very first appearance, Ultron's relationship with the original Ant-Man has been a massive part of his character, and it's something that writers have sought to explore over the past few decades. However, one of the most interesting examinations of Ultron's psyche and his relationship with his creator came in 2015, in the form of Rick Remender and Jerome Opena's original graphic novel, Rage of Ultron. Released concurrently with Marvel's epic Secret Wars event, this comic was designed to not only provide a conclusion to the decades-long war between Pym and Ultron, but also usher in a new status quo for Earth's mightiest heroes, setting up the Avengers roster, history, and stories for the post-Secret Wars Marvel universe. Although this relaunch didn't entirely come to pass, with Remender leaving Marvel after Secret Wars, and the all-new all-different Avengers series instead being written by Mark Waid, Rage of Ultron remains a fascinating look into what might have been a unique take on the company's flagship superhero group, and a fascinating deconstruction of one of comics' greatest villains, and the fallen hero who made him. So in this video, I want to explain the history behind Rage of Ultron, discuss how Rick Remender and Jerome Opena attempted to tell the final installment of this saga between Ultron and Hank Pym, and how this series ultimately represents a missed opportunity to usher in an exciting new era for the Avengers. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. In order to explain the significance of Rage of Ultron, it's first worth highlighting just how this story came to be, and where it exists within the history of the Avengers. Ultron first appeared in 1968's Avengers issue 54. Created by founding member Hank Pym, the android was designed to aid the heroes in their global peacekeeping efforts, and was modelled after the original Ant-Man's own brain patterns. However, it's quickly revealed that something went wrong. Ultron awakens as a monstrous dark reflection of his creator, with the sole purpose of destroying the Avengers and conquering the world. Ultron's early appearances saw him unite with the Masters of Evil, taking on the identity of the Crimson Cowl before they're thwarted by the Avengers and Ultron's own creation, the Vision. From this initial storyline, the complicated relationship between Pym, Ultron and Vision is laid out. Whereas Ultron rebelled against his maker, seeking to destroy everything Hank holds dear, Vision disobeys his own purpose, refusing to take part in Ultron's villainous crusade, and instead fights alongside Hank and the Avengers. Over the next few decades, Ultron would make regular appearances in various Marvel comics, taking part in the company-wide crossover Secret Wars in 1984, and the following year featuring in the brand new series West Coast Avengers. Ultron's status as one of Marvel's most deadly villains would continue into the new millennium. Following Kurt Busiek and George Perez's acclaimed 1999 storyline, Ultron Unlimited, the character's creator Roy Thomas returned to pen the one-shot story The Ultron Imperative in 2001, while Brian Michael Bendis would feature the android in his Mighty Avengers run that began in 2007. Rage of Ultron specifically, though, was born out of the events of a far more recent story, the similarly named 10-issue miniseries Age of Ultron, released in 2012. Written by Bendis with art by Brian Hitch, this story details the villain's closest attempt at achieving his goal of world domination, creating a dark alternate future where Ultron has annihilated almost all of humanity, with only Wolverine and the Invisible Woman left to stop him. The climax of Age of Ultron sees Wolverine attempting to assassinate Hank Pym to prevent the android's creation, but instead, the heroes are able to build a failsafe into the villain's coding that will destroy Ultron if he ever goes rogue. In the present day, after the Avengers defeat Ultron and the dark future is prevented, Pym contemplates his involvement in humanity's possible downfall, and after experiencing a crisis of faith, chooses to rededicate himself to superheroics, and using his scientific research to ensure a better tomorrow. Pym's internal crisis in Age of Ultron leads directly into the events of Remender and Opena's follow-up, where the hero is forced to atone for his past mistakes and confront the dark reflection that he created. Remender explained how this series sought to explore the generational trauma shared between Pym and Ultron, as well as their descendants Vision and Victor Mancha. In an interview with comicbook.com, the writer stated that
the story really is more focused on the evolution of Ultron. What we're doing here is taking that character to the next step of his evolution, as well as addressing his relationship with his father, Hank Pym, and his relationship with his son, Victor Mancha, who is also an insane and murderous artificial intelligence. And what happens is something that ultimately will lead to a new Ultron and have huge ramifications on those characters. I think ultimately this is an Ultron at the peak of his rage and his desire for vengeance. And as he comes to exact that vengeance and to return his pain upon his father, we see a very emotional creature. We see his rage come full circle.
It's worth noting that by 2014, when Rage of Ultron was being produced, Rick Remender had become a major name within Marvel Comics. After first establishing himself on Uncanny X-Force and Captain America, he would begin working in the Avengers corner of the universe in 2012, first working on Secret Avengers before teaming with John Cassaday to create the Uncanny Avengers. Born out of the events of Avengers vs. X-Men, Uncanny introduced a brand new team of heroes that represented both sides of the superhero community, led by Steve Rogers and including the likes of Wolverine, Rogue, Havoc, and the Scarlet Witch. This unique take on Earth's mightiest heroes impressed the higher-ups at Marvel and led to Remender writing the 2014 crossover Axis. Although Axis was met with a rather underwhelming reception upon its release, Remender had proved to be a more than capable writer with the Avengers, and with Marvel set for their biggest relaunch in decades following Jonathan Hickman and Asad Ribic's Secret Wars the following year, plans were put in place for the writer to pen the flagship Avengers title and usher the team into a bold new era. As such, Rage of Ultron was commissioned as an original graphic novel that would bridge the gap between the pre- and post-Secret Wars Avengers, tie in with the upcoming MCU film of a similar name, and allow the creator to tease the kind of stories he would tell once this epic event had concluded. However, while this series would introduce readers to a new Avengers lineup, the writer's focus always remained on Ultron, Pym, and the Vision. As Remender explained,
the biggest and sexiest Avengers are not the ones that have emotional and contextual relationships to Ultron. Thor, Cap, and Iron Man don't really have anything to do with Ultron other than trying to stop his attacks on humanity. So it made me a bit nervous to hinge an entire graphic novel that was going to be supporting the biggest movie of the year on Hank Pym and the Vision. I recognize though that they, as father and son to Ultron, had the most emotional context, and I should not worry myself so much with what seems to be the biggest idea and go with the one that's the most natural. That was to really explore their relationship and to finish up the conversation about artificial intelligence that really fueled much of my Secret Avengers run. In the end, it was a risk, and sometimes risks don't pay off. It seems like people really enjoyed the book though, so I'm glad that we dug into Hank and the Vision and gave them the spotlight.
Alongside artists Jerome Opena and Pepe Larraz, Remender got to work devising a story that would serve as the bridge between two distinct eras of the Avengers, both in terms of publishing and also the team's canonical history, with Rage of Ultron featuring two distinct versions of the ensemble and their battles with the android villain throughout its history. The idea was seemingly that in order to breathe new life into the team and start a brand new chapter in their long-running story, it was first important to provide closure to one of the Avengers' longest conflicts, and provide a fitting epilogue to the complicated saga of Hank Pym and Ultron. And as such, in March of 2015, a one-shot graphic novel hit shelves around the world, one that would offer a fascinating look into what lay ahead for Earth's mightiest heroes, and depicted the final act of rage for one of their greatest and most fearsome foes. But to get a better sense of the ideas behind Rage of Ultron, as well as how it fits into the wider world of the Avengers comic, and the career of Rick Remender as a writer, I sat down with Dallas Taylor of the Comics Collective podcast to discuss the history behind this graphic novel, how it reflects the larger themes throughout the writer's career, and what the legacy of this often overlooked story is on the modern history of the Avengers.
Rick Remender is one of my favorite comic book writers, and I honestly, reading this now, where this was one of the first books of his I picked up after, I think Uncanny X-Force was my first, and then I pick up this. returning to it, this is a Rosetta Stone for who Rick Remender is as a creative. He is daddy issues incarnate and analyzing generational trauma and how to not become your father in every single book he's written. I think my favorite examples of that and just of his work in general are Black Science, Low, and Deadly Class that he's done for Image Comics. Though he has very few misses. He has a few, but they are few and far between in his larger oeuvre. I think this book hit me very hard the first time I read it. I viewed it very positively. It hit me right at the right moment to start recognizing creative talent that I wanted to continue to follow. So I picked this up off of name recognition, which isn't something I do as much anymore, at least character name recognition, and then flipped back to the who made this. I need more of that, and began the sort of second saga of my comic book career of following creative talents. And I mean, here specifically, Rick Remender, someone who I've read 95% of his work at this point. And I think in doing that and returning to this book for the first time since I read it this week ahead of this, I was shocked at how much of Rick was already there and how he continues to circle this same central problem of forgiving the generations before you and forgiving yourself. I just think he's a really interesting creative because he's always trying to say something, right? Like, you are presented with the opportunity to have the Avengers fight Ultron as a loose tie-in to an upcoming MCU movie. And Rick Remender doesn't see that as an easy paycheck. He sees that as an opportunity to really dive into the relationship of Hank Pym and Ultron. This could be just another, oh, that was a fun Ultron story, but it becomes one of the best Hank Pym stories I've ever read. And he's a character that has been largely underserved and consistently swept to the side for reasons larger than the character. And it's just so interesting to take the legacy of this character, Hank Pym, both inside and outside of comics, and say, here is a broken man that made a broken thing. That's where our story lies.
Rage of Ultron begins with a flashback to the early days of the Avengers' career, where the team discover Ultron attempting to steal nuclear weapons in order to destroy humanity. As the heroes race to prevent Ultron's plan, we're immediately thrust into the perspective of Hank Pym, then Yellowjacket, and the burden of responsibility he feels as the villain's maker. The Quinjet crashes and all hope appears lost, but then in a last-ditch attempt to prevent nuclear annihilation, Pym attempts to reach out and empathise with Ultron, calling him his son and trying to talk him out of his evil plan. Suddenly overwhelmed by emotions, Ultron stalls long enough for the Avengers to regroup, blindsiding the android and trapping him inside a vibranium-covered rocket, and with the villain now unable to escape, the aircraft is shot into space, seemingly never to return. Years later though, now in the present day, Pym rejoins the Avengers as Giant Man, working alongside a new generation of heroes as Earth's protectors. However, the ghosts of his past soon reappear as the Avengers are visited by Star Fox, who reveals that Ultron had crashed on his homeworld Titan some time ago, and upon being found, infected both the planet's core and all of its inhabitants, turning the entire world into a dark reflection of himself and his thirst for vengeance. Shocked by this, the Avengers suit up and travel to Titan, but before they can, they're ambushed by a fleet of robots modelled after each member of the group, as a giant moon bearing Ultron's face suddenly enters the Earth's orbit. The heroes are able to defeat Ultron's soldiers, and upon arriving on Titan, they discover the extent of the villain's conquest. After surveying the planet, Vision reveals that Ultron is broadcasting his location to him, threatening to infect all of Earth if Pym doesn't meet him. Faced with no other option, Giant Man ventures to Ultron's fortress alone, coming face to face with his maniacal creation for the first time in years. Ultron taunts Hank, referring to him as his father and explaining that in his isolation, he was able to locate Hank's memories in his system. Ultron states that Pym cast him off as a monster, a project gone wrong who didn't resemble his maker at all. But after watching his entire life and reading his subconscious, he knows that Pym also despises humanity, and Ultron is nothing more than a perfect recreation of his creator. Hank refutes this, but Ultron declares that they are one and the same, and that in Pym's guilt, he built a sun to destroy the world that he never felt he belonged in. Giant Man begins to get emotional before the Vision who had phased inside of Pym leaps out and starts to attack Ultron. The two androids battle, with Vision attempting to phase into Ultron, merging their bodies and allowing Hank to destroy them both. But as they begin to fuse, Ultron screams in pain, begging for his father to save him. Hank attempts to reach out, but in the inverse of their previous encounter, he's tricked by Ultron, who forces Vision out of his system and instead merges with Pym. Watching this on from a distance, Captain America notices an explosion coming from Ultron's base, and upon entering it, he finds Vision unconscious on the floor, and standing over him is a new-looked Ultron, one far more human and with a mask resembling that of Giant Man's. This new Ultron declares that the father and the son have merged, and that we are Ultron. Sam and Vision attempt to fight Ultron, desperate to rescue Pym from inside of the villain. However, Vision and Ultron crash through the building and fight onto the streets of Titan, where Ultron states that he wasn't Hank's child but his reflection, and that in the same way, Vision is his reflection too. Rejecting this, Vision blasts Ultron as Star Fox intervenes and uses his powers to trap Ultron in his own subconscious. Here, we witness the moment Pym first created the android. As Ultron began to become sentient, it immediately recognized humanity as a threat, and scared, Hank frantically tried to destroy the machine, but as he failed to dismantle Ultron, he calls his creation broken before remarking that he too is broken. In the present day, Ultron shrieks in pain at this memory, flying off into the depths of space and leaving the Avengers to regroup. Sometime after, the Avengers hold a funeral for Hank Pym, believing that the hero died when Ultron attempted to merge with him. The heroes remark that although Hank was flawed, he sought to make the world a better place, and despite the guilt and the rage that he felt, he never gave up on his dream. The Wasp leads this farewell to the founding Avenger, as all of the heroes say goodbye to their fallen friend. Meanwhile, in the furthest reaches of space, we see Ultron floating amongst the stars. Seemingly at peace, it's revealed that the android now contains a human heart at its centre, suggesting that, in some way, Hank Pym is still alive, and now actually a part of his most complicated creation. In my opinion, Rage of Ultron is one of the most underappreciated Avengers stories of all time, and a fantastic climax to the 50-year struggle between Hank Pym and Ultron. This comic is all about the relationships between parents and their children, guilt, and the generational trauma that can push family members apart. Hank Pym has always been a complicated figure within Marvel Comics, and the creation of Ultron has always been one of his darkest and most regrettable moments. Regardless of which persona he's adopted over the years, Hank has always seemed to find himself haunted by the guilt of creating Ultron, blaming himself for making something hell-bent on destroying everything he holds dear. Over the years, writers have built on this anxiety by exploring Hank's childhood, revealing his own strained relationship with his father and how those memories manifest in his guilt towards Ultron. Ever since his first appearance, Ultron has served to embody Pym's fears and insecurities, and it's here in this series that Remender and Opena force the hero to confront his darkness head-on, urging Pym to come to terms with his past and accept both himself and his creation in order to move on to a better tomorrow. In a way, Remender's presentation of Hank and Ultron's relationship mirrors that of classic monster stories, most notably Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. As Devin Meenan notes, writing for IGN,
Ultron's desire for companionship overlaps with another story of creation gone wrong, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Remender writes Ultron much like Shelley's Adam, determined to avenge himself on a parent who would not love him. By making Ultron's legacy of violence the fault of not just the android himself, but Hank as well, the comic in turn explores Hank's own simmering resentments and how those bled into his creation. With Hank as his creator, Ultron's rage was predestined.
During my conversation with Dallas, we discussed how these ideas of fatherhood, guilt, and trauma manifested throughout Rage of Ultron, and how the story seeks to give a fitting conclusion to the decades-long toil between the founding Avenger and his android creation.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of this book is the first half of the book being driven by this emotional pull of Ultron as the wronged child of Hank Pym, and the relationship being defined that way, saying, you don't like me because I reflect poorly on you. You created me, and then you want to take my autonomy away. I think that's something that many children that have caught themselves in controlling parents' grasps have felt. And so it ends up making Ultron much more sympathetic than he's been in the past in a really interesting way. But then the real crux of the story for me is in the modern day when we flip it on its head and Ultron says, I am not your child, I am your darkest impulses. I am your dark mirror. I am the Hyde to your Dr. Jekyll. And I honestly love that so much. I think, like I said at the top of this, Ultron, when played as a maniacal, angry robot, insert our fears about AI here character, he is fun, but not necessarily interesting. But in this story, he gets to teach us so much about one of these founding Avengers. I love the bit where we talk about Hank Pym as someone who cannot find an image of himself that people will like. And so Ultron being the answer to that. Again, I think Hank Pym is a largely unlikable character, like we talked about, and yet Remender gives him so much sympathy. He gives him this edge to him that makes you want to root for him, that makes you understand, like, oh, this whole yellow jacket thing he's got going on is just trying to be someone that everyone else will like. And again, like we sympathized with Ultron earlier, wanting to be loved unconditionally by our creator, we sympathize with Hank Pym saying, like, oh, we all want to be seen. We all want to be understood. And so to then butt those characters against each other, who at their heart just refuse to understand each other and refuse to give each other grace, and then to ultimately finish that saga by forcing them to accept each other, by saying, like, I love that last page, the Ultron with the beating heart, saying, I have to accept that we are one and the same, and we have to forgive ourselves for that.
In the aftermath of Rage of Ultron, this Ultron-Pym hybrid, often referred to as Pymtron, would reappear in several Marvel titles. Most notably, in Jerry Duggan's run on Uncanny Avengers, Ultron would attempt to infiltrate the team as Hank Pym. After gaining the trust of several members, Ultron's motives are discovered by the Wasp, leading to a battle between the heroes and the villain that resulted in Ultron being fused to a ship and teleported towards the sun. Unsurprisingly, he would eventually return, reappearing in Dan Slott's Iron Man series, where he's taking shelter in the abandoned Avengers mansion and attempting to reckon with the two personalities within him. Exploring the connection between his human and robotic sides, the android devises a plan to experiment on other humans, leading him into a conflict with Tony Stark. It's during Tony's fight with Ultron, though, that the hero reveals an unexpected twist. Iron Man claims that Ultron's cyborgs only simulated their human side after their merger, and that the actual person fused is killed during the process, suggesting that Hank Pym is actually dead, and his voice and personality is just a figment of Ultron's imagination. However, while Marvel were keen to explore this new version of Ultron further, it's worth noting that Rage was initially designed to introduce a brand new Avengers status quo, with Rick Remender set to write the team's main comic after Secret Wars. This unfortunately never came to pass. According to the writer, although he was working on plans to follow up this story in his Avengers run, those plans were derailed once Marvel approached him to instead work on the X-Men. However, Remender would leave Marvel in 2014 before either of these runs were greenlit, and in his place, Mark Waid would write the all-new, all-different Avengers that began after the end of Secret Wars. While Waid's Avengers did attempt to relaunch the ensemble, featuring a new team of heroes including Miles Morales and Kamala Khan, it was a noticeably different lineup from the one introduced in Rage of Ultron. And as this new series unfolded, it became clear that Marvel was going in a different direction than the one Remender and Opena had teased. As a result of this, in the years since its release, Avengers Rage of Ultron has become something of a forgotten gem within Marvel's recent history. A fascinating, self-contained examination of the Avengers' most complex and often underappreciated member, alongside being an excellent story to kickstart a new era for the team. Overall, it's hard not to see the missed opportunities and wasted potential within each page of Rage of Ultron. Revisiting the book when writing this video, I was truly shocked at how much I enjoyed this story. Remender made me genuinely connect with Hank Pym in a way I never really had before, and sincerely understand his struggles and complexities. Even though Rage wasn't followed up on in the way most expected, I would still argue that this story deserves plenty of acclaim and focus. In just 100 or so pages, Remender and Jerome Opena were able to craft arguably the definitive modern Hank Pym tale, a thought-provoking story about legacy, fatherhood, and how we come to terms with the ghosts of our past mistakes. It's not just a terrific Pym and Ultron story though. In my opinion, it's one of the best Avengers books produced in the last decade, and a clear indication of why Marvel really should produce more one-shot graphic novels. Although it may not have been followed up on and has somewhat become forgotten in the near 10 years since its release, I maintain that Rage of Ultron is still one of the most unique stories in Marvel's modern history, and one of the most compelling and intriguing Avengers tales ever put onto the printed page. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on this video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you enjoyed this and you want some more, there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy. I want to give a big special thanks to Dallas from the Comics Collective podcast for joining me on this video today. Dallas is fantastic and we had a super insightful chat about all things related to Rage of Ultron. The full interview that I did with him will be over on the Patreon, but in the meantime I will leave links to Dallas's socials in the description, so please do go follow him on socials and check up with the Comics Collective podcast. If you want to help support this channel though, you can go to patreon.com/OwenLikesComics, or if you just want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at OwenLikesComics. But that's all for this video. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.